Hi everyone, and welcome to today's session on what we can learn from the US FDA Precertification Program. So first of all, thank you all for joining, and thanks to our speakers and moderator, Lesley Maloney from Roche Diagnostics, Krista Woodley from Johnson & Johnson, and Manan Hathi from Stryker. So next, please. So before we start, just a simple technical instruction. So we will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. If you have any question, you can use the chat box and we will answer during the Q&A. Next, please, Manan. So this webinar is part of the work that we are doing at APAC Med with the Digital Health Committee. So this is a new committee that we started a few months ago. We have 30 members from large multinational companies, SMEs, and startups. And we have two objectives. The first one is to create and share knowledge around digital health. And the second one is to advocate for policies in the region that can enable and ease digital health. So we are working on several areas: cybersecurity, interoperability, reimbursement, regulatory. And then we cover also some transversal issues related to digital health. So this webinar today is the first one of a capacity building series of webinars that we just started with the regulatory working group. So I'm very happy to have today these fantastic speakers and moderators to guide us through the US FDA Precertification Program. So yeah, I hope you will all enjoy this presentation, and I will let now Manan Hathi to give an introduction to this program. Thank you very much. Over to you, Manan.
Thank you, Roberta, and hello everyone. Welcome to the APAC Med Learning webinar series on the capacity building for FDA Precert. I'm Manan Hathi. As Roberta said, I will be moderating this session. I am the global process owner for digital health regulations at Stryker. And as part of that role, I also support advocacy efforts on digital health for Stryker. I've been fortunate to work with both our speakers today, Lesley and Krista, as well as being an active member of the Digital Health Committee that Roberta mentioned on APAC Med. So I'll start by introducing our speakers a little bit today. They will do a more detailed introduction, but Lesley Maloney is the head of software regulatory for Roche Diagnostics. She guides regulatory policy efforts in the US and globally. And notably, she has held several senior roles at FDA prior to joining Roche. Similarly, Krista is the senior director of technological quality at Johnson & Johnson. And she has quality oversight over Johnson & Johnson's digital health solutions. Both Lesley and Krista have been participants in the FDA Precertification Pilot Program, which is essentially a novel method for regulating digital health products that FDA is piloting. So they have some great insights that they will share with us on what the program is, what the experience is in actually participating in the pilot. And we will hear from them for the next hour or so. And then please, we would love to hear from you. We are going to have a Q&A session at the end. So if you have any questions, please mention it. As Roberta mentioned, please type it into the chat box and we will get to it at the end. And if we can't somehow get to all of the questions, then we will disseminate the answers later on after the webinar too. So please feel free to share questions. We would love it and welcome it. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Lesley for an overview of the Precert program.
Thank you, Manan. I'm excited to be talking with you guys a little bit about Precert as well as Roche's experience so far in the pilot program. Next slide. Let us launch right in though. And I'm going to talk quickly, so I'll try to slow myself down, but to give us enough time to hear from you all and for you to ask us questions about our experience so far. So next slide. I think that we could agree that current regulations do a good job of ensuring the safety and effectiveness of our products, but they're really not optimal for the fast pace and iterative nature of software and digital health. And that is why we have said we actually need a risk-based fit-for-purpose regulatory framework so that these digital technologies can reach users at the speed and the demand in which they need them. And this is not just something that's focused on the US. This is globally what we're seeing regulatory authorities start to grapple with, of the different nature of software and how the regulations and the frameworks currently in existence are just ill-suited. By doing this, by reimagining these regulatory frameworks, then we really can meet the demands of our healthcare system, utilize the big data that exists and has really been unused to date, and reach that goal I think many of us share around personalized healthcare and delivering better outcomes to patients at the end of the day. Next slide. So what this means, I think for all of us, we're medical device companies, in vitro diagnostic companies, but those traditional pathways to market are ill-suited for digital health, where we might have a product, an IVD, an assay, for example, at Roche, that could take months, sometimes years to bring to market. That just isn't realistic for software. And that's where this idea of reimagining really comes from. And it's not just something that Roche thought of, it's industry as well as FDA and other regulators going, what we have now is creating bottlenecks. It's delaying access to innovative technologies that patients and users need. And all it takes is for COVID-19 to occur, and we all can recognize the value and the need for digital health and the necessity, how necessary it is in times like this in order to continue to deliver care, whether it's telehealth or whether it's actual, mental health apps that are helping patients cope with stress and anxiety, depression, whatever it may be. There are opportunities that today's, what we're facing day in and day out with COVID are demanding the pathways shape and change in new and fundamental ways. So in order to do this, our existing regulations really need to change, to be reimagined. You're going to hear me say that word a lot. That can be your take-home message. These bottlenecks that we're seeing with the regulatory frameworks, because software, think about it iterates. We have products that are changing, a new version coming out every 2 weeks. And that doesn't fit when you think about a product needing to have FDA review every 2 weeks, or any other regulatory review every 2 weeks, isn't just sustainable, especially with the number of products that are coming to market and the number of modifications all of these software products demand. Next slide. So FDA really combined the idea of appropriately qualifying what type of software should be regulated as a device, how you classify the risk of that product, how you streamline reviews, and then these alternative pathways to market in their pre-certification pilot program. This is a voluntary pilot that allows FDA to tailor their approach to regulating these digital technologies and create this agile regulatory paradigm. Now, it is focused on organizations rather than individual products. And we'll get into that a little bit more and the benefits of that, if you will, when Krista and I talk about some of our experiences. The current scope of the software pilot is software as a medical device. So this is not for us in the IVD world, the software and medical devices driving our instruments or allowing the glucose meter to work. That's not the software we're talking about here. It's really kind of that standalone software app, if you will. What the pre-cert pilot does is look up at how software developers, how all of us as companies can demonstrate that we have a culture of quality and organizational excellence, CQOE. And in order to demonstrate that, we also have to commit that we're going to monitor the real performance of our products once they enter the US market. So as you shift more of the burden from the pre-market to the post-market, you've got to have a robust system, again, to be monitoring that in real time to be able to protect patients and ensure that safety and effectiveness is still met. Because it is clear and important for all of us to understand that alternative pathways like the software pre-cert are not intending to lower the bar, to lessen, regulatory oversight in the sense that unsafe products or products that don't have high quality are getting to users. That's the opposite of what we want to happen. These are the same standards for safety and effectiveness that we have to meet with current devices, but the way and the timing of which that data is presented to US FDA is different than what we might see for a therapeutic device or IVD. Next slide. There were over 100 applicants to the pre-certification pilot program when FDA first kind of put out this notice that they were going to accept volunteers. Roche and J&J were the two, what we would say, traditional medical device companies. J&J obviously therapeutic devices and Roche is IVDs, but FDA really wanted to get a broad range of participants. So you see traditional software developers like Apple or Samsung, small startup companies like Pear or Tidepool, very different models and ways in which they develop software. But FDA really wanted this variety to figure out what does software excellence look like across these various companies and types. Next slide. The intent of the program, as I said, is really leveraging the information and data that we all already do as a part of software development. So it's really not supposed to be something new and different for us as companies who are developing these SAMD products, but really, what do you do day in and day out that indicates you are a trusted software developer, a trusted partner, if you will, for FDA, so that you can have a more efficient and streamlined approach to bringing these products to market, and FDA can focus its limited resources on those products or companies that present a higher risk, either because they have less experience in developing software or maybe don't have as good systems or don't do it as frequently. Again, and this type of intent allows a modern and tailored approach that allows our products to get to the market in a timely fashion while still protecting patients. That culture of quality and organizational excellence is key to ensure that we have high quality SAMD, that patients can trust it, that clinicians who are using these tools can also trust them in making these critical decisions for their patients. Next slide. The CQOE is really based on 5 key principles: the patient safety, product quality, clinical responsibility, cybersecurity responsibility, and proactive culture. So the domains and other components that FDA does as part of its Excellence Appraisal, you'll see in my next slide, all map to these 5 core principles. How are you demonstrating your commitment to safe patient experiences with the software you're developing? How are you building quality into these software products? What is your clinical how are you protecting patients and being patient-centric with the software? Because it's not enough at the end of the day maybe you can develop software, but how do you build that clinical impact on it? Because developing a video game software, very different from a software that's going to be guiding clinicians in surgery or helping patients treat or diagnose a cancer. Next slide. As I mentioned, the FDA has talked about, through their working model, and you'll see this in their document, about the total product lifecycle approach. So this isn't a one-time in and you're done. This is really just that CQOE, that you have this entire culture and you're evaluating, constantly monitoring your environment, your organization to catch things before they happen. It's not that you're a perfect company, you're not going to have bugs, you're not going to have issues with the software, everybody does, but that you have a safety net in place that can quickly identify and remedy those issues when they happen. So it starts with these 4 components that make up the pre-cert pilot: an excellence appraisal, where you're demonstrating this culture of quality and organizational excellence; the review determination, where you're taking the intended use of that software and defining what product claims, what risk it has. If the product requires review by FDA, and that depends on a couple of factors I'll talk about in a minute, then you have a streamlined review. Once the product's on the market, again, you're committing to that real-world performance monitoring, not only of the product itself, but also you as an organization, to make sure you're continuing to meet those 5 key principles that I talked about. Next slide. So the first component is the excellence appraisal. And this is, Krista can talk a lot about this because she spent a lot of time thinking through this as part of the pilot participants. You have to be eligible and you define what your business unit is, whether that is, a software center of excellence within your organization or a specific business area, or your entire organization that you want to have FDA or a third party assess. You apply, FDA confirms you, they receive the application, they do the appraisal, looking at these objective indicators, determine from that whether or not you have met these KPIs, and give you or assign a pre-certification level. Right now there is either level 1 or level 2 being tested. And then again, the maintenance of that excellence appraisal over time. Next slide. The 5 excellence principles I mentioned previously are listed here on the left, and you can see these domains on your right where how they map, and you have to demonstrate through a dashboard or some other data that you're bringing to FDA and can show them how you are tracking to the 5 excellence principles. Now, some of these can seem familiar to what you might have in a traditional audit, but others, such as the people or leadership and organizational support, might not be something that's in an MDSAP audit. These are our new things trying to get, again, what is the culture in which you develop software? Are you a trusted entity that would allow you to have some of the benefits that I'm going to mention in a bit? Next slide. Now, the component 2 is the review pathway determination. So this is after there's an excellence appraisal that's looking at your organization, and I should say really looking at the policies and the procedures, the way in which you develop the software, the people that you hire and use to support and develop that and deploy it. You have to say, let's move from the organizational approach to a specific product. And this is that review pathway. So you bring in a specific software product, and FDA is going to help you determine whether or not you would need pre-market review. So that's going to depend on both your level of pre-certification as well as the risk categorization. And FDA in the pre-cert pilot is testing the IMDRF risk categorization framework. Next slide, which is great because we want to see and continue to drive global convergence in using IMDRF. This is FDA's chart, which heavily from IMDRF's clinical evaluation guidance, as well as its risk categorization SAMD guidances. This is really looking at, and this is where the benefit comes in, about what level of pre-certification you have and what your benefits are going to be based on that. If you take away, let's say, pardon me, that the pre-cert pilot didn't exist, any of these initial products and even the products that have major changes, those would all be things that we would need to submit an application for to FDA. Maybe not some low risk one, but for the sake of argument, let's say everything in one of these 9 categories is going to require an application and a review period by FDA before it can go to market. You can see already, so that's like your traditional review approach. You already have benefits because at a minimum, you're getting a streamlined review. So you already have benefits beyond no pre-certification. Go even further, and based on that level of pre-certification, whether you're a level 1 or a level 2 is obviously a higher pre-certification level, you may be able to have products that go straight to market and don't require review at all. So that's in both the initial product and then our major changes, only those products of the highest risk, products that are critical for, intended to diagnose or treat a critical patient population or condition, should say condition, not patient population, would require a streamlined review. So lots of benefits here that we can see on the pre-market side, but that's why that post-market and that robust real-world data monitoring is so important. Next slide. As far as streamlined review, again, we want streamlined processes. FDA has done a lot of the majority of the work, we would say, for the operations, the policies, procedures are done and assessed in that excellence appraisal. So that when it comes to review determination and streamlined review, they're only looking at the specific risks and benefits of that product. They don't need to ask about how do you develop cybersecurity because they assess that as part of the excellence appraisal. They only need to maybe talk about cybersecurity for that specific app or standalone software they're looking at there. The goal here is faster review times and FDA looking at new ways, interactive reviews, screen sharing, so you can really test the limits of the software in real time. Next slide. As you can see here, this is a graph that, or a table chart that FDA had in its working model. The review timelines are intended to be much shorter. Again, looking at only reviewing those elements that are necessary for that specific software product, tailoring it for software products as opposed to an implantable device where some of those elements are ill-suited for what the types of questions and data points that you might need for software. Next slide. And that slide demonstrates some of those review elements here. Product specific, a few administrative elements, and then some elements you're able to leverage from other components. The goal here is a lot of data that you aren't having to come up with independently in the sense of leveraging standards, not reiterating or having FDA re-review anything they've already done. As part of excellence appraisal, let's focus it on my specific product. What's the algorithm? What are the hazard analysis? Again, product specific that they want to look at here. Next slide. The last piece, the last component of the pre-cert pilot relates to real-world performance. I've talked a lot about that already. This is obviously cool to look how the product is performing, you are using the product, and how we as an organization are performing. And that all goes back into just a loop of building, and data points and how we iterate and modify to make it a more safe and effective product. Next slide. Now, the last piece I'll share before turning it over to Krista is just experience. As we were selected to be participants, we were kind of split up as the 9 of us to various components. So Krista may talk about her experience some with the excellence appraisal, and J&J has taken a heavy focus on real world performance as well. We at Roche identified we really wanted to work on that review determination, how FDA would identify the risk of these products, as well as streamline review. Because strategically it was, regardless of the pre-cert pilot work out, how they assign risk to software and review. There can be win here even if you aren't a pilot participant. So that's where we spent a lot of time working with FDA and other stakeholders across the industry. So where Manan and I's paths really crossed a lot. Then thinking through, what is that like? In 2019 is when the companies really started testing the working model, where we did some excellence appraisals, trying to decide individually as companies, what does a fit for purpose QMS look like? And that's a challenge, I think, for any traditional medical device or IVD company to consider when, as compared to those software developers who only have developed software. So I'll talk more about Roche's experience. I want to turn it over to Krista to share what J&J has done as part of their experience in the pre-cert pilot.
And then, guys, if you have any questions, feel free to type in the chat box. So for right now, we'll turn it over to Krista.
Thank you. Next slide. And one more after that. Okay, so our journey, it's been a relatively long journey. I think as Lesley talked about, there was some selection going on in the 2017 time frame, and all of us had the opportunity, not just J&J, but Roche and Samsung and others, had the opportunity to spend time with the FDA in Q4, really to kind of set out the expectations. We did a lot of, I would say, introductions of our programs, whether it be cybersecurity or how we do software as medical device development. Even had some conversations around real-world performance analytics as well, because with a lot of our drug products and other devices that we have on the market, we had already started to initiate some work in this space. So had, some great introductory meetings, but really, we started to roll up our sleeves in 2018. And so the FDA, really appreciating software development principles and practices, that they wanted to use an agile approach. So we went through, kind of multiple cycles of the working model, including, different versions of the excellence appraisal and different components. And so as we continue to kind of shape out these elements, what the FDA said, and we said, yeah, we'd love to sign up for that, was what I call unit testing of the excellence appraisal. So what they did is, it was around October 2018 for us, we brought in some consultants, or I should say FDA brought in some consultants, and they were actually trained in CMMI, because one of the, I would say, kind of precedent thoughts around excellence appraisal was around leveraging some of these maturity models that are already out there. And so these guys came in, and it was really a learning experience, and we'll talk about it in the next slide. But we did this abbreviated test. We only tested a selection of the different elements, and again, a lot of really good learnings came out around how the actual excellence appraisals work, what are the outcomes that they want to drive from those excellence appraisals? How do we want to conduct those, whether it be internal or external? So I'll get into those details in the next slide. But what we did was a successful unit test. So we really figured out what was working. We figured out what things we need to modify. And again, I'll probably get in a little bit more detail on the next slide. But I do want to say that that testing was very informative to the version 1.0 of the working model that was released in January 2019. As we moved into 2019, we had a kind of a more interesting experience, I would say, than some of the other pilot participants. So as you know, there's 9 of us. Only 6 of us have gone through excellence appraisal tests right now. So yeah, just due to scheduling and different things, I would, yeah, about 5 or 6 went, and around September of last year, we were supposed to go right around Labor Day. The FDA said they learned a lot through those tests. You know, they did much more end-to-end, got a lot of insights around, you know, how does the excellence appraisal, again, itself need to work? What kinds of things do we need to look at in advance versus just showing up on site? Some companies had longer excellence appraisals, some shorter. So the FDA came back to us and said, hey, we want to actually think differently for the remainder of the folks that need to go. And what they did to tweak it is they said a couple of things. One, we want to kind of break out the excellence appraisal into more manageable chunks. And we also too want to find a way to think about how can we do this remotely. And the reason why they wanted to do it remotely, because this was definitely pre-COVID, was they wanted to have the ability to have more folks from the agency kind of watch how this works, take notes, and see, again, how can we execute this in a way that's really going to get the biggest bang for the buck, both from the FDA, but also for the companies themselves. So we had originally said, okay, we will go ahead and start our revised excellence appraisal, starting with the design and development domain. And that was right when COVID started. I think it was around, you know, late February we were scheduled to go. And, you know, things really started to heat up, you know, around that late Feb, early March timeframe. So we have not gone through our end-to-end test yet, but we have had conversations with FDA. And in fact, we just had one today about this modular approach, how much pre-work is needed to really be effective, what are the outcomes that we're trying to drive with both the pre-work and, you know, the review of that work and the Q&A with that would come afterwards. So again, our journey has been a little bit different, and I think Lesley is going to talk a little bit about the journey at Roche. But again, I think having gone through some of the shaping exercises and also, you know, even kind of taking this new modular approach has been very informative for both sides. So next slide. So as you guys know, J&J is a very complex company. We have 3 different sectors that we support. So we have consumer, med device, and pharma. I think that was just discussed earlier. But then we have you know, a many shared services group that support all of these sectors. So that would be our information security and risk management group, our technology teams, our medical safety teams, clinical teams, et cetera, et cetera. So when we first went through this test appraisal back in October, we have to, you know, admit that it was not an easy exercise, especially for the CMMI guys. I think the FDA folks were a little bit more understanding. They've dealt with J&J in previous inspections, but to really piece together how the end-to-end model works, you know, thinking about the 5 excellence principles, thinking about the domains and elements, you know, having to kind of, you know, have your safety guys who don't report in through the same folks as the other guys that are doing product development, and then you got IT over in another space. And, you know, we started to realize that this is actually harder for larger companies. Most have said, well, when you get into pre-cert, the challenge is going to be these little companies that don't have the resources to build up the capabilities to go through an excellence appraisal and do real-world performance. Yeah, but you know, the simplicity of a small company and be able to execute this type of evaluation, it's much more streamlined. You know, I think about Tidepool and their experiences. You know, they've got, you know, a team of 20, 30 people. everything is so seamless because the organization is so much smaller. You know, J&J, we're flying people in from California and Europe, and, you know, just, so, you know, the takeaway here is that we've got to be able to think about all the different shapes and sizes and configurations of a company to make this successful. And, you know, funny enough, we're actually kind of finding out with this remote modular approach, it might actually be easier for a company like J&J, you know, so we'll see how it goes, but we're starting to find out that we can pull the resources, and it does make for an easier conversation, both logistically and especially the opportunity to provide this pre-work package. You know, it gets a lot of that organizational stuff out of the way, and we can just dig right in. Another thing we learned, and again, this was more around the test that we did in October, but we will need to be mindful of this, especially if we kind of do break this out into more modularized kind of, you know, appraisals, that, you know, we do need to look at these together. So it all ticks and ties back to the excellence principles that Lesley just walked us through, and its domains and elements are kind of subsets of those. So we'll need to make sure that you know, that these appraisals work in a way that we're looking at everything kind of in context with each other. And again, you know, it might have just been design of this kind of unit test or whatever, but we acknowledge that we weren't able to tell our whole story, so to speak. So we have to be very careful about that. An observation that we had as well, and again, I think the FDA is still trying to work out what is going to be the right model, but I think as companies get more and more engaged in this, they are going to have to rely on third-party appraisers, and we have to make sure they have that end-to-end experience. You know, some folks may be really strong on the technical side, you know, really good software developers, know how to pick up static code analysis and read right through the lines, and then you might have others that are more from the, I would say, you know, research, science, medical side that may not have that same software development experience. So to find the right appraisal model, whether it be the FDA themselves and or third parties, it's going to be very important that they have the right skills to evaluate all of these together. The FDA has always said that they want these appraisals to be a quote unquote paperless back room. I think you guys may have heard of an effort called cost of quality. The vision is that, you know, the FDA and or these third-party appraisals or appraisers can come in and watch your operations, kind of interview your SMEs, you know, a little bit more, yeah, less formal, I think, than a, you know, traditional inspection where we have the big heavy back rooms, front rooms, back rooms, etc. They say they, you know, they don't want that, but we have to be ready for it anyway, because during our excellence appraisal test, yeah, we were still pulling up SOPs, we were still pulling up records and things like that. So we just want to be mindful that, you know, it's a little bit of mix where, you know, we're going to have to provide background information on how things work, but then also to the expectation around sitting in Scrum meetings and interviewing SMEs and you know, different kinds of things than we would traditionally see in an inspection would occur. Okay, next slide. Now again, having been less involved in the regulatory determination and streamline review, I don't have as much to say around that, but I do want to talk a little bit about what we're doing around real-world performance analytics. So another team member is leading this, as, you know, as Lesley described. There's, you know, different components kind of being, you know, supported by different team members across the 9 companies. We seem to have doubled down on the excellence appraisal and RWPA, which is kind of funny because this really drives the closed loop aspect of the program. So, you know, in the old days, you know, obviously you did your safety reporting, your complaints, you know, it's a little bit of a myopic view on what's going on with the product. Now they're anticipating, again, a much broader, you know, 360 aperture kind of look at the product to make sure that, you know, we're really making, obviously, you know, good determinations around product support and maintenance and all that, but then also to maintaining that certification. So, you know, obviously we all have a lot of metrics that, you know, both at the organizational level and at the product level that we can share, but we really want to be, you know, mindful of what are those key KPIs or what are those key measures that we'll want to show that kind of demonstrate, you know, better health outcomes with the product, high levels of usability, and then also product performance. But we're also too realizing that there might be some metering going on, so it's not like we could say, okay, I'm going to always show these KPIs for product performance, or I'm always going to show these for health outcomes. We really have to understand the risk of the product, its intended use, what we see the evolution of the product looking like. So, I think that this is going to be, a very interesting experience, especially as we learn. Again, we're doing this already for some of our, I would say, traditional medical devices and drug products, but as it pertains to software as a medical device, really coming up with those key KPIs that show us, how these three measures are being met will be key. And I think we're continuing to kind of debate. I think there's always going to be a kind of a base level set that we're always going to want to report on: security patching, availability and performance of the software. We're going to be looking at, health outcomes. We got to look at claims versus, what kind of extended uses there are, usability. But again, I think the product profile and intended use will also have a heavy hand in dictating what that looks like. And, I think I've already mentioned this, but, again, I think a lot of folks, it's going to be a big mind shift to move away from, here are my traditionally, reportable things like, again, complaints and AEs and things like that. Now we're opening up the kimono, it's, sharing, hey, we've actually had insights and, maybe even, different insights around, health outcomes that we didn't expect, but that might be, a label extension as a possibility. User experience, how many click strokes does it take to get to a particular function? Or, what are my usability rates? We're not used to disclosing things like that. And then product performance, crash rates, and, again, things around security that, maybe we, in a traditional IT shop, those are top of the list and go on your CIO reports, but not traditionally used to sharing that with, the health authorities. So this is going to be very important. And also, too, with RWPA, it's with software, you can instrument in the collection of this data. So, as opposed to, waiting for some period of time to get your, product complaint information or, things like that. Now we'll have more real-time data being collected by these systems that can actually help us gain these insights. So, really planning this into the intended use and design is going to be important. Okay, next slide. And Lesley, back to you.
Thank you. Manan, can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I wanted, and I'm sorry, just click through those, to share a little bit just about our experience. We have gone through an excellence appraisal. We did one in August of last year. So clearly a struggle for a company the size of Roche, similar to what Krista shared with J&J, is choosing the scope of our pre-cert. We have multiple business areas, which can include possibly different approaches to how we develop software. So to test the working model, FDA had said, every company decide your, each of us 9, decide your business unit that you want to take through and pick, a product that's either a 510K or a de novo. Is really looking kind of at the moderate risk class of products. So we decided to focus on a business within Roche that is solely software, and that's MySugar. This is a company we acquired in 2017, and they only develop software. They have a QMS that's ISO 13485 certified, though, and it's a phenomenal organization, really kind of that startup culture that we were really excited to share with FDA. So the product we decided to use for our test phase of the working model was their insulin bolus calculator, which was launched in the EU, but not in the US. Now, it's important to note that MySugar has a variety of software modules, some of which are regulated and some of which are not. And so we were focusing on, again, this bolus calculator for consumer use that was not regulated, or I should say, is a regulated product. The bolus calculator is being reviewed under the traditional or current review pathway. So it's important to understand, I think there's a lot of confusion as I've talked to other people interested in the pre-cert, that are you already getting pre-certified? What does this mean? And even companies who've said, we're the first company to go through pre-cert. Nobody is pre-certified. This is still a pilot phase. This product that I'm talking about, the MySugar product, is being reviewed just like any other, if Manan submitted a software product, his product's reviewed under the same pathway as Krista and everything, the traditional review pathways. What FDA is doing is, in parallel to this traditional review, they're looking at the excellence appraisal, the intended use, that review determination of this product, as well as doing a streamline review to say, at the end of this, do we come up with the same recommendation? Do we have access to the same information that we do for a traditional review approach? So it's kind of like a clinical trial, and in that sense of the control is the traditional, and then this testing, the pre-cert approach. So they are looking at this under the traditional review pathway and determining, again, is the information sufficient? Next slide. So our experience with this excellence appraisal, My Sugar is located in Vienna, Austria, and FDA didn't have the ability to travel to Vienna last year. So we did this where we flew folks in from My Sugar to Washington, D.C., to our offices there. FDA brought some staff down, and we really did the face-to-face there. You know, it wasn't FDA headquarters, but it was at our offices in the Washington, D.C. area. The benefit, though, is that My Sugar, although we had them on site and we used video conferences to talk to others who were in Vienna, we had, you know, the My Sugar team had everything they needed at their fingertips. So FDA is able to ask questions and have this dialogue for the excellence appraisal, and we're able to just quickly, you know, show these different KPIs on the screens. There was work, obviously, that went into it prior to being ready for that excellence appraisal. But at the end of the day, and Krista and I can talk to this more, FDA is not wanting any company to do something new. This goes back to that culture of organizational excellence and quality. This should be what you do day in and day out. It shouldn't be something different to get pre-certified, because if you truly are a trusted partner, this is the way in which you develop software, you know, on a rainy day as well as on a pre-cert day. So FDA had a template based on doing a variety of other excellence appraisals with a few of the other pilot participants, that they went through the different elements and domains in the working model. They wanted to make sure that our processes were in control, from how we make decisions to how we gather data. They're very interested in how we close and how close our medical officers and clinical team is to how we make decisions about the safety and the different other ways we're doing surveillance for these types of products. My Sugar provided an example of where one morning they caught an issue, worked with their internal team at My Sugar, and were able to deploy the fix to 1.5 million users of that software the same day. So that's just being able to tell FDA in real time, this is how quickly we can fix issues. And again, demonstrating that culture that we have, that we are trusted partners, or not just partners, but trusted developers of software. At the end of the day, we're looking, we're constantly surveying, and then being able to quickly respond and fix those bugs or issues when we see them, or feedback we get from users. This continues to be an evolving process for FDA. I mean, Krista talked you through the various iterations they have undergone and how FDA has changed their thinking from starting out with a small, you know, startup of 20 and 30 people like Tidepool to doing, you know, Verily, doing Roche's excellence appraisal, what these all look like, what should the questions they ask, the approach be, so that there is some way that once they would roll this program fully out, they aren't trying to recreate the wheel every single time for each different company who's coming in the door. We found that the questions that FDA asked for the excellence appraisal were fair, that both FDA and Roche really benefited from doing the pre-work, and Krista had mentioned the pre-work they're kind of going through now. The biggest miss that we felt, in our opinion, was that due to timing, the reviewer for our actual product wasn't able to participate in our excellence appraisal. And based on other conversations we've had with reviewers who really will say, and they're still becoming comfortable with this idea of pre-certification themselves within FDA, we've heard from reviewers, I really want to see the product, I want to be there, or I just don't know if I can trust it. So there's that education and comfort level from the review staff at the agency as well. Next slide. And I think I will turn it back over to you, Manan, and we'll take questions.
All right. So thank you both, Lesley and Krista, for that insight. Let's go to the audience and see if we can, if we have a couple of questions. We have some comments. So what are the key challenges faced when trying to adapt a software as a medical device to pre-cert requirements? I think this goes into what we were just talking about. But maybe Lesley, if you want to take that and move forward.
Yeah, I mean, as far as how I said the challenges for adopting the SAMD is at the end of the day, you really aren't doing anything different for your SAMD development. You're still following the international standards. You're looking, to IMDRF and the ways in which you should be categorizing. You have to go again to your local jurisdiction and how are they classifying the risk of these products. But we really aren't doing, my sugar's not doing anything that they wouldn't be doing already if they weren't part of the pre-cert. Now there's more work just because we're involved in this pilot and providing a lot more feedback and engagement with FDA than we would be traditionally if you just were going under this review pathway, because you're really doing two jobs at once. But the software itself we're not doing anything different from that sense. The one thing I would say we are thinking about internally, and this is just a Roche specific issue, is what going forward would be the business unit we would take, because we have these different business areas, as I talked about, who might do software all in different ways. What does it make sense for going forward with a pre-cert of what you'd want to get pre-certified? Would it be all of Roche? Would it be our molecular business? Would it be our clinical chemistry business? Would it be my sugar? What is that the QMS going to look like? Would you have multiple pre-certifications? So that we'll have to continue to think about, but the products themselves and the way we do it, that hasn't changed. Krista, anything for you on that?
I think I was on mute. Okay, yes. No, I mean, Lesley, you summed it up perfectly. I mean, the FDA has been very open with us saying that in order to get a pre-certification status, there's no dictation on your software development practices, or if you want to use Agile versus you want to use traditional waterfall. I mean, if you think back to the quality system requirements and obviously the regulations, et cetera, I think the conversations we've had with them is, hey, if you want to embrace automation, embrace automation. If you want to use agile development, use agile development. Keep doing what you're doing. Lesley, you've said that so many times, and so well said, because that's always been the message we're hearing too. But we need you guys to demonstrate excellence. And one of the things that's been a mind shift, I think, for us, and I'd love to hear your opinion too, Lesley, is, this is the shift to looking at records and looking at SOPs to really looking at KPIs. Looking at measures, looking at, what are these indicators that are showing that you are meeting basically the standards set out by the Excellence Appraisal. So, going through this, I'd say modular kind of review of our D&D artifacts, we still had I would say the habit of providing a bunch of records and SOPs, and they said, that's good, but let's start with the metrics and then let's work our way down. And if we need exemplars, we need things to kind of flush out the story, we'll do that. So I would say that that's been the biggest shift. But yeah, I think that they've been very supportive of keep doing what you're doing. And what you're doing, if you're doing what you're doing well, it should be all the criteria set forth in the program.
Yep.
Okay. Let's take another one from the audience. This is from Arun Sitharaman from Crowley Healthcare. And the question is really, the gist of it is, would you expect that there would be anything different if there were significant amount of artificial intelligence-based algorithms? So he was using my sugar as an example and asking if that has AI or not, but would there be any difference whether it has AI or not, I guess is the question.
One of the things that we as industry had pushed for, and we're glad to see that FDA intended for the pre-cert, this alternative pathway, to include AI in terms of, and you've seen, FDA come out with their artificial intelligence, like that change protocol type guidance that they came out with to begin thinking about modifications. But this is really the pre-market side. Before you even get the product to the market, what does that look like? And I think from our perspective, we view at Roche, AI is just a component, a subset of SAMD. So the way in which you're validating, especially for more static AI, when we talk about continuously learning, yes, there obviously are some different factors you have to take into account. And I know Singapore is thinking about that as well, the regulators there. But what does that mean? You know, FDA is the reason FDA developed this pre-cert is that you need to be able to have some flexibility in what the data points they're able to ask for. You know, my sugar, and I'm not the product expert here, don't believe it uses any artificial intelligence. I don't know that for sure, but I don't think that we do. But I wouldn't anticipate that the pre-cert is intended to balloon, to allow those types of data points, those questions, those type of new technologies to absorb it, so that we don't have to, in the US, keep going to our Congress, our legislators, to ask them to give FDA authority. The pre-cert is intended, and we talk about the pre-cert authority in another way, but intended to allow these emerging technologies to be taken into account there. So that was a very long answer to your question of, no, I don't think there's anything new that we have to do specifically to AI. That being said, continuously learning AI, we all know, has some other pieces that regulators across the world are still grappling with how to effectively oversee those types of technologies. And Krista, I don't know, you might have more to add here too.
Yeah, you know, this has been a hot topic. And I remember when they issued version 1 of the working model, we all had the opportunity to provide feedback. And one of the questions in there is, you know, should AI be left out? And we passionately said, no, it needs to be in. You know, everything around what we're doing with big data, using these applications to help us, you know, make clinical decisions or, you know, drive diagnoses, et cetera, is going to be reliant on AI. And funny enough, what we said is actually a program like Precert will allow us to embrace artificial intelligence, especially with the continuously learning. Because if we have a current regulatory paradigm right now where all changes require notification, you can't let that algorithm learn, and you can't let it, you know, continuously evolve, right? So you have to have a program like Precert. Yeah, well, we have to have a boundary definition of where that AI, you know, what are the trigger points that require some kind of notification. Yes, we'll have to figure that out, and that's what that white paper is about. But you almost absolutely have to have Precert in place in order to leverage that type of technology. So we've been very keen on, you know, we would be, you know, amiss if we left that out. And, you know, again, trying to build the programs. How do you validate, you know, artificial intelligence, and especially the CLS programs? Yeah, it's a different ballgame. You got training data sets you got to think about. You got to be cautious about, you know, bias. You got to be mindful around, you know, how do we kind of notice the drift in the AI and you know, have the ability to kind of monitor and pull it back if necessary. That's a different ballgame when it comes to validation, but definitely shouldn't be a different ballgame when it comes to this. So I think, you know, this program just supports that technology even more.
Awesome. So there's a really interesting question coming in from the audience from Sandeep, and it's if I can paraphrase that correctly, it's like we talked about how large companies or small companies could apply for Precert. What he's asking about is, how about if you have innovative digital medtech SMEs as opposed to larger companies? So, and I think in the early part we talked about certifying people versus certifying companies, but I think that's an interesting question that, you know, I would open it up to the panel.
It's the first I've heard of it.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say, like, I haven't heard anyone bring that one up before. It's a great idea. You could easily see helping companies think through, because Krista and I share the same thing of FDA saying, well, don't do that the Roche way. Do that, you know, think smaller, Roche. Don't do it your traditional way. Think smaller. And so you need people helping pressure test that. And to your point that you said earlier, Krista, it's not easier for a larger company. In some ways, it's going to be easier for a smaller company to build this versus a Roche, like tearing it apart so that it is more agile. So I don't know, I haven't heard this before, but I agree. I don't see why you couldn't. Right now, it's focused on organizations, but it's an interesting idea to put forward to FDA, for sure.
Absolutely.
And I know they're also very considerate of the fact that they're not going to be able to do this themselves. So that certification might be at the appraiser level. I mean, to certify a person, I mean, you're looking at clinical responsibility, cyber responsibility, product quality, organizational excellence. Yeah, I mean, clinical responsibility. I mean, that's a lot for one man to do, right? So, you know, I looking at the feasibility, but I do know that they are trying to figure out as far as, you know, what they call like building the infrastructure components of this. So not the 4 things we talked about, but how are we going to make it happen from a regulatory statute law, but also to how are we going to actually formally execute these things. I know they're pretty clear that they're going to need a you know, reliance on third parties, and I think that's where you'll see more of that individualized certification kind of come through.
Yeah,
to certify appraisers.
Awesome. So going into the discussion of you know, comparing with the traditional medical device space versus this pre-certification program, you know, software development usually uses the agile methodology, and traditional design controls are really geared more towards a waterfall model. Now, granted, FDA hasn't really said that their design controls procedures don't mandate that you have to do it waterfall. I just wanted to get your thoughts on, as participants in the pilot, you know, have you seen a difference? Is it easier to use the agile methodology, maybe if you're using the pre-certification program versus the traditional model? And maybe Krista, if you can start with that.
Yeah, and I'll definitely touch on the excellence appraisal piece in the RWPA, but I actually think it's going to, you know, apply to all 4 components. But the cool in particular, I think all of them, but the cool in particular is obviously very passionate about leveraging the IT practices that you see outside of our industry. He often quotes, you know, the Googles and the Salesforces and all of these guys, and he knows they're best-in-class software developers. And so he wants us to embrace that. And so I wouldn't say they're telling us not to do design controls. I mean, there was a little bit of a running joke when we were put $1 in a jar when you say design control, but, you know, like, you know, they're not going to tell us how to do things, but what they're expecting from us is we need to have the same high quality, again, excellent outcomes with these development practices. And then again, being measured with the appropriate KPIs. So in the spirit of Agile, you know, and if you think about the spirit of the excellence appraisal, they actually go very hand in hand. Small teams working together, lots of communication, lots of clarity around, you know, what our expected outcomes are supposed to be, lots of communication and check-ins and constant monitoring around performance, or whether it's through the software development practice itself, whether it's around using automation to really kind of sniff out any kind of code anomalies, looking at data sets, you know, in your post-production type settings or your post-market settings to look at, you know, get those signals to eventually kind of feed that agile loop again and feed that backlog. So I think that they have been very embracing of any new technologies. And I can tell you right now, during the conversations we had and the visits we had, when we were able to show some of the tool stack that we had and what we're calling our digital factory, you know, it was definitely something that was very appealing to the team. Bakul was very happy with, you know, the metrics we were, you know, generating from that. Again, the indicators and how our Scrum teams are working. So I will probably defer to Lesley as it pertains to, you know, I would say the traditional kind of regulatory notifications and all that. But again, the whole premise around pre-cert is around not having that same level of notification requirements, not having those same submission requirements based on risk. So I think it's quite suitable.
Awesome.
Lesley, anything you want to add?
No, I think you got it.
Awesome. So speaking on the excellence appraisal piece, right? I mean, is there, you know, we'd already talked about how there isn't something different that companies need to do in order to, you know, prepare for a pre-certification or an excellence appraisal. However, you know, as regulatory bodies may be looking at the pre-cert program as a model to learn from, is there something that the regulator maybe would have to prepare for, right? So I know if you look at just Asia Pacific in general, right, Europe and Australia, so particularly for the Asia Pacific region, Australia already kind of has a model where they accept third-party reviews on appraisals, and so they can actually leverage that. Versus China is usually sending their investigators overseas to do an excellence appraisal. So if you can, just comment on that. Like, is there something different that the regulators would have to prepare for if they were to put this pre-cert pilot in place?
I can go first on that one. I think having the skill set, Krista already alluded to this, having the skill set within FDA to do this type of work is something that they knew was going to be a challenge, which is why they first started out with having, professional appraisers kind of come in. But those appraisers didn't have the clinical expertise that is so critical to these types of products and critical to the role of regulators. And so that's what, as it started, it quickly went back to, all right, FDA is going to do this themselves. And I think that they're still trying to figure out how could this be rolled out within FDA, and I'm not sure necessarily how other countries could implement a pre-cert pilot itself or have the resources to do something like this. It's why, Manan, you talk about Australia or Singapore or others who are already doing reliance. And I would hope that countries, and I'm not quite answering the question, but I would hope that other countries would think about, they don't need to build a pre-cert program from scratch. What they do need to think about is, what is the regulatory pathway we should have for software? Whether or not it looks like pre-cert, there needs to be a way where we understand these products need a different approach than a device or an IVD in order to meet the demands, again, of patients and clinicians, and to meet the modifications and the technologies like AI, like someone from the audience had asked, that just don't fit the modifications that you don't even know maybe are occurring sometimes. You have to let the machine learn on its own. You're not going to be able to stop every time and take that up for a regulator or notify them for change management. So we want other countries to be thinking about the way in which they regulate software, making sure it's appropriately qualified. They shouldn't be regulating things that are low risk. Looking to US FDA and Canada, and TGA has got a new guidance out, draft guides for that as well. But then thinking about, how can I leverage what other countries like the US are doing? If they have a product that gets approved through pre-cert, then think about, could you rely on that approval? We'd like to see more countries taking up those types of approaches, which, move towards global convergence and streamlining and getting these products to patients in those countries even faster. That's kind of my thinking along those lines. Krista, I don't know if you have a different opinion on that.
Really, I think just the orchestration is going to be interesting, because you're going to have, a team of people doing the excellence appraisal, and then there's going to be a streamline review, and some of the guys that are doing the, the review, to obviously grant approval for those higher risk products, are going to have to be very reliant on the trust, if you will, of having that company pre-certified. And so what I've heard from the FDA is, we have to establish that level playing field. We can't have bias in what, quote unquote, somebody kind of, pre-certified, what that really means. And then we have to still be able to provide the reviewers enough information so they can review the streamlined review package. And so I think there's, at least I've heard, just how are these teams even within the FDA going to be able to kind of rely on, what they're extracting from the excellence appraisal, and if they need that kind of backup information for the streamline review. So, it's a logistical kind of mechanical thing, but, it's how are these kind of different people looking at different things going to ultimately feed together? Whereas I think in a traditional sense, you have your 510K submission and you have your reviewers, and they get to see everything all at the same time. So that's going to be a little bit different as well.
Well, thank you for that. And I think, Lesley, you might have alluded to this already in your previous answer, but I wanted to make sure in the 5 minutes we have, as we touch on, the US FDA definitely has a lot more resources. And it's really a novel approach that they are putting forward. However, not every regulator around Asia Pacific would have the same level of resources as the FDA does. So in your opinion, are there certain elements of the pre-cert maybe that would be easily adapted for a fit for purpose regulatory framework?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a great question, and one that I think at Roche has just been so important to us, and we've loved seeing how much APAC is interested in digital health, and in many ways kind of outpacing where FDA has been. FDA started with this pre-cert, and then it's kind of stalled in many ways because it's a huge program to think about actually deploying. And we see Singapore, Australia, Japan, and others wanting to talk about what can we do. I think we've really focused on 4 areas, which is appropriate qualification of software. So what products should be regulated, which should not. That goes back to the functionality. And again, TGA has just come out with a great guidance around that. I think they did a really good job on. Then it is the appropriate classification of software, starting with IMDRF and those risk categorizations for SAMD, and trying to adapt those to the local jurisdictions. They inform, they drive, they treat, diagnose, and how do you map that to how you currently classify, medical devices or IVDs, and thinking about, we need to do this different for software. And again, we've got countries in APAC who are already, released guidances and are thinking that way. The third would be streamline review, and looking at, or I should say, third is clinical evaluation. How do you evaluate? How do you develop clinical data to validate these products and ensure the analytical and clinical validation supports its intended use? And the fourth is the alternative pathway, whether that is adopting things such as a change protocol that you agree, and this is the approach FDA is using for artificial intelligence, is once the software is to market, what is the band, kind of the bucket in which I can make all these modifications and not have to come back to the agency for review. That's one approach. You can do the streamline review, which is a very easy thing of focusing on those elements that are particularly important for software and aren't necessary when you think about what is necessary for a therapeutic device or an IVD. Very different. Thinking about the recognition and reliance that I talked about, and then pre-cert is kind of pulling it all together, but it's just not realistic. So if I had to say the top 2 for a country who isn't maybe as fully resourced as FDA, get your risk classification correct, get your qualification right. I'm going to lie, I'm going to say 3: qualification and classification, and then some type of alternative pathway and review approach for software.
Awesome. Well, I think that brings us pretty much to the end of our time almost. If we have not answered your questions, then rest assured we will get back to you after the webinar. I know our excellent speakers have already been answering questions in the chat. So thank you both for your time today and for joining us. And Roberta, back to you.
Thank you, Manan. So yeah, for sure we will collect the questions and try to collect also the answer and share them back to you. I also wanted to say that the recording of this webinar will be available on our website on the member section. So for you to have again a look or to share with your colleagues. So Manan, can you help me with the next slide, please? I wanted just to say that actually this is the first event of this capacity building series that we just launched with the Digital Health Regulatory Working Group. So today we discussed about this US FDA Precertification Program as one of the examples that we can take to regulate digital health. There will be more events coming in the next months. So, for example, I know we discussed a lot with our speakers today about AI. So the next webinar will be in the end of June 25th, on regulatory and AI. So we will bring 2 speakers to share their point of view and experience on regulatory in AI from an industry perspective and also a legal perspective. So you can all join. We will share the details later. And let me thank once again these speakers and moderator for today's session. It was really, really interesting. And yeah, I hope we will collaborate again in the future. I really enjoyed this session today. Thanks a lot, all of you, and thanks for the attendees to join this morning. And yeah, see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.